thanks everybody for turning out. This is a great turnout for this event. Obviously, big, major event going on in the news. I'm Dan Slater. I'm the director of the WCED Center for Emerging Democracies. And welcome to our Flashpoint session on the 20th National Congress of the Chinese Communist Party. We try to do these Flashpoint events a few times a semester. We did one on the Brazilian elections most recently, which you can watch on WCED's YouTube. And so we saw this one coming. And so this one's been planned for a while because we knew this was going to be a big pivotal moment in Chinese political history. And I think, there's always a gap between what experts know and what the kind of commentariat know who are watching the news and what we see in the news. But I think it's hard to imagine a topic where the gap is bigger than on what's going on in China with the Congress happening presently. So we're very, very fortunate to have such an amazing team of experts here to help fill us in on what is unfolding and ongoing, and then to open up to discussion with all of you here in person and on Zoom. Let me just really briefly introduce our three panelists, and then we'll start things off. So immediately to my left, not politically, but at the table, well, maybe politically, I don't know. I guess I shouldn't, yeah, is Mary Gallagher, as I'm sure you all know. So Mary is the Amy and Alan Lowenstein Professor of Democracy, Democratization, and Human Rights at the University of Michigan, and she's also the director of the International Institute right here. Mary is an expert in Chinese politics, law and society, and labor politics. Her most recent book is Authoritarian Legality in China, Law, Workers, and the State, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2017. Further on the left is Joseph Torigian. Joseph is an assistant professor at the School of International Service at American University in Washington. His new book, Prestige, Manipulation, and Coercion, Elite Power Struggles in the Soviet Union and China After Stalin and Mao, was recently released with Yale University Press, and he has a forthcoming biography on Xi Jinping's father with Stanford University Press. And third, Jundai Liu. Jundai is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies here at the University of Michigan. She was a WCED postdoctoral fellow from 2019 to 2021. She is currently working on a book manuscript that examines grassroots democracy in contemporary village China. Jundai received her PhD in sociology from Harvard University. So very excited to have the comments from all three of our commentators today, and as our outside guest, although I think Joseph has spent more time in Michigan than maybe any of us since he grew up here and was an undergrad here. But Joseph will be kicking things off for us, so why don't you go ahead and go first? There's no need. We have the camera. We'll be able to zoom in, and you're fine where you are.
Great. So. Hi, everyone. Well, first of all, thank you to Derek for planning everything and Dan for serving as chair. Always great to be in my home state of Michigan and visit my alma mater. Here we are in the middle of the 20th Party Congress. We have the political report, but we don't have the final lineup of the new leadership, so it's a particularly hard and challenging time to be talking about what's going on. If you're here for predictions from me about who the next leadership will be, you're out of luck. I've seen several news reports as well as other lists that have been circulating, and they're all completely different. I think that this lack of clarity is also very revealing about the nature of politics right now. But I think that once the new leadership is clear, that won't be this sudden moment where we have an understanding of what's actually going on in Zhongnanhai, because any new leadership lineup will be inherently ambiguous, because if Xi Jinping picks someone to be premier with whom he doesn't have a lot of ties previously, that might mean that he's weak and needed to give something to people in the party who are skeptical about him, or it might mean that even people who didn't have a lot of ties with him in the past are now Xi Jinping loyalists who have won Xi Jinping's trust and that Xi Jinping feels that he can continue to dominate. And then, of course, if he picks someone with whom he's always been very close, that might seem like he is strong because he can get a choice like that. But it could be interpreted to mean that he's weak because he can only trust people like that. So even if we were having this meeting a week or two later, we might not be able to say that much more about what's new in terms of our understanding about Chinese elite politics. But in fact, Chinese politics have always been very hard to understand. In 2012, Nicholas Kristof, op-ed columnist for the New York Times, wrote, "The new paramount leader, Xi Jinping, will spearhead a resurgence of economic reform and probably some political easing as well. Mao's body will be hauled out of Tiananmen Square on his watch, and Liu Xiaobo, the Nobel Peace Prize winning writer, will be released from prison. Nicholas Kristof had been in China for many, many years. He's a real China expert, and he got it wrong. But it wasn't just Western observers who were surprised by who Xi Jinping has revealed himself to be. The China specialists in the room and online might have heard the name of Li Rui. He was a former secretary to Mao Zedong, was in the organization department during the 1980s, and then was this Liberal Party intellectual in Beijing for many decades after that. We have his diaries now available at Stanford University in the Hoover Archive. And what's so striking is that you see that in 2012, people like Li Rui, similar to Nicholas Kristof, thought that Xi Jinping would be a reformer. Part of the reason for that was Li Rui was a close friend of Xi Jinping's father. But we can see in sort of real time in these archives, people realizing that Xi Jinping is actually going to be someone very different from whom they expected. And Li Rui on his deathbed said to his daughter, as well as one of the sons of Hu Yaobang, a pro-reform general secretary in the 1980s, I have no idea how Xi Jinping became the kind of person that he is. My task to you is to figure out why this could have happened. So the question is, what parts of the Chinese system allowed Xi Jinping to become the style of leader he has revealed himself to be? And also, what made Xi Jinping the kind of person that he is? And to answer these questions, I'm not going to play the mugs game of picking-ology, because contemporaneous observers are notoriously bad at getting Chinese politics right in real time. So instead, what I'll try to do today is look to history to provide some context. And to foreshadow my answers to these questions, first, as to why Xi Jinping is able to become such a powerful leader, is that the CCP has always been extremely leader-friendly, and that the more evidence we have about Chinese history over the last few decades, the more we understand that this idea of a trend toward institutionalization and collective leadership is problematic. And for the answer to the second question about who Xi Jinping is and why he is that way, I'll argue that his experiences during the Cultural Revolution and Reform era turned him into a person deeply committed to the party, obsessed with the idea of conviction and motivation, but also an individual that stresses continuity with the past and is generally skeptical of utopian ideals. But let's begin with the past. So some people have said that Xi Jinping is the most powerful leader in decades, maybe ever. But let's look at that claim. I'll go a little bit down memory road, but you'll hopefully indulge me because this was something that was covered in the Wall Street Journal a few weeks ago, which was this meeting in 1962 during the Great Leap Forward, the so-called 7,000 Party Cadre Conference. And why was this in the Wall Street Journal? Well, Li Keqiang, the Chinese premier, had made a series of statements, including one at a very big meeting of regional officials, that led certain observers to conclude that Li Keqiang had started a new line and was openly bucking Xi Jinping, and that there were echoes in the Chinese past, that in this meeting in 1962, the 7,000 Party Cadre Conference was another example of a failed leader facing resistance because of incompetence. Well, one of the reasons we have that idea of the 7,000 Party Cadre Conference is because of these comments by a man named Peng Zhen. So Peng Zhen criticized Mao at this meeting, which led to some feelings that Mao was under attack. Mao was in trouble. I talked about this to a party historian in China, and this person told me that outside historians had gotten the story wrong. And that essentially what had happened was Peng Zhen knew that Mao had used those own words, those words, critical words about himself, and Peng Zhen learned about them and was essentially repeating what Mao had said because he thought that's what the kind of message wanted to go out. And what's interesting, people even at that meeting criticized Peng Zhen for making those comments. So the idea that you would criticize the top leader at a moment of vulnerability doesn't really fit our understanding of Chinese politics, because in moments of crisis, you circle the wagons and you don't challenge the top leader because of how destabilizing that is. So that sense of history can help you contextualize things like the speech that Li Keqiang gave to make you more skeptical of these ideas that he's actually directly challenging the top leader. So Xi Jinping is also very often compared to Deng Xiaoping. And the reason for that is people talk about the Deng era as a moment in Chinese history when the leadership concluded that the lessons of the Mao era was that strongman rule was disastrous. and that collective leadership was needed, institutionalization was needed, balance within the leadership was needed. But the more evidence we have, the more we understand that even Deng Xiaoping was someone who unambiguously thought about the party as only functioning effectively with a core, with one leader who could make final decisions that would then be enforced. So people who have studied Chinese history have heard the name Chen Yun. So he was the other most senior figure in the CCP in the 1980s. His revolutionary prestige and status rivaled Deng's. But essentially, during the 1980s, Chen's top goal was not to balance or buck Deng, it was to preserve Deng's authority and prestige at all costs. Sometimes Chen Yun would complain that there were never any meetings of the Politburo Standing Committee meeting. And the reason for that was Deng didn't even want to give a chance for Chen to speak his mind. On the eve of the crackdown on Tiananmen Square in 1989, Chen Yun gave a speech in favor of martial law in which he referred to Deng Xiaoping as Tozi. And for Chinese speakers in the room, they know that this is a term that has triad, mafia-esque connotations, sort of like capo de capo. When Chen's words were published openly, that word was changed to core, but it shows the extent to which even Chen saw Deng as the top dog within the party. So then the question becomes is, why wasn't there political institutionalization? And the real answer is that Deng saw his authority as key to party effectiveness. So some people would say to Deng Xiaoping, why don't we have real political reform? And he would say, well, that's having three governments, meaning the United States with the legislative, executive, and judicial branch. We're not like that. We have the ability to hold a meeting and then be decisive about its conclusion. So why was Deng so powerful? Well, first is that the CCP as a Leninist organization has always had a taboo against factions, and that people find it very dangerous to act in concert to pursue a policy goal. There's a sense within the party that it only really functions with a core, that if you don't have someone who can make final decisions, that nothing ever gets done. Deng Xiaoping had awesome prestige as one of the key members of the founding generation of the People's Republic of China. He had a special relationship with the military as one of the legendary generals, including during the so-called Huaihai campaign, which combined two field armies and smashed the KMT and ensured victory in the Revolutionary War. He had a very special relationship with high-ranking members within the People's Liberation Army. But at the same time, Deng Xiaoping was not someone who was involved in the day-to-day decision-making. He was vulnerable to accusations that he ruled from behind the curtain. This created a lot of pathologies in Chinese politics that we can talk about, some of which I think that Xi Jinping has learned from, because often his top deputies would misintuit what he wanted, or there would be suspicion between those deputies and Deng Xiaoping, which is why Deng fired two of his named successors and nearly fired a third. So Xi Jinping shares many of these strengths, but is different in key ways. Most crucially, Xi Jinping is both the core in terms of authority, but also deeply involved in day-to-day decision makings in a way that Deng was not. But he also lacks the awesome natural power that Deng had as a member of the founding generation. So it's at least conceivable for Xi Jinping, I think, to face challenges within the party, although extremely unlikely, whereas Deng Xiaoping, I think, really had absolute power. And ultimately, whether or not Xi Jinping is more powerful than Deng, we can't really know because he hasn't gone through the same stress tests that Deng as leader did. Deng was able to engineer a war against Vietnam in 1979, even though he still wasn't the top leader and most people in the leadership didn't want that war. In 1984, on a trip to the South, he suddenly, before there was a consensus within the leadership, declared that special economic zones were good. 1987, he suddenly removed Hu Yaobang from power, the pro-reform general secretary. 1988, he started a price reform that nearly destroyed reform and opening. 1989, he was almost the only one in the leadership who wanted a violent crackdown and was able to achieve it. 1992, he restarted reform and opening, even though at that time he had no formal positions within the party or the military. Xi Jinping has never made any decisions as dramatic and sudden as those, I would argue, with the possible exception of the regulatory blitz last year. But now let's talk about Xi Jinping the person, now that I've talked a little bit about continuities in elite politics. Let me begin by saying that Xi Jinping was a particularly cautious leader before he became the general secretary, which is, I think, one of the reasons why so many people were surprised by him. Arguably, one of the reasons for that is his father was purged in 1962, which was many years earlier than most of the other leadership was attacked during the Cultural Revolution. And people have theorized that one of the reasons he's been so careful, especially before he came to power, was he was in such a position of political vulnerability for so long. But I want to focus on two other issues primarily. The first is Xi's obsession with idealism and distaste for instability and radical politics. And let me begin with this, his emotional commitment to the party and why he cares so much about other people feeling the same way. Well, he grew up in a revolutionary household. He talked about how he would listen to his father talk about the revolution until he and his siblings had calluses on their ears. His father was interesting for many reasons. One was that Xi Jinping's father used to brag about how many times he was persecuted by his own party. In fact, on one occasion he said, "I was persecuted 5 times, whereas Deng Xiaoping was only purged 3 times. And for people who don't understand Bolshevik political culture, that seems like something that's quite strange until you understand that for people like that, going through struggles and going through these wrenching experiences not only reveal your dedication to the cause, but strengthen it. And so for Xi Jinping to see his father suffer more than almost anyone of that generation, but to describe himself as believing in the Communist Party even more because of that, I think can really have a very fundamental impact on someone, especially at a young age. But also, what's interesting about Xi Jinping is that at the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, because his father had already been purged, he was considered one of the 5 black elements, which meant that he was not able to join the other first generation of Red Guards, who were primarily the offspring of high-ranking officials. And we know from other people who were like this, people who were princelings but weren't allowed to join those first generation of Red Guards, it was extremely galling because they weren't allowed to participate in this moment of extreme pathos. And it made them want to prove themselves even more. And then when Xi Jinping was exiled to the countryside as a sent-down youth, he's reflected on many occasions about how so many of his generation were disillusioned because they brought these utopian radical ideas to the countryside and saw that they were failing. And it really made them question the party. And Xi Jinping has said that precisely because his beliefs were challenged and he still returned to the party's mission, that's why he believes in it stronger than anybody else. And in the 1980s, when he talked about why he wanted to go work at the grassroots in the provinces as opposed to make money or study overseas or stay in Beijing, it was because he wanted to prevent another cultural revolution from happening, and the meaning of his life was the party, not making up for lost time like so many other people in his generation. So these ideas are kind of leftist, conservative in a way, this preoccupation with belief and dedication to the party. But these are also mixed with sort of rightist, using Chinese political jargon, ideas that are related to a phobia of chaos and also a skepticism of utopian politics. And I think that was partly related to the family experiences during the Cultural Revolution. So Xi Jinping was subjected to struggle sessions in which his mother participated. Xi Jinping was incarcerated in Beijing, and in the 80s he would tell interviewers that it was so bad he thought that he was going to die. When he was a sent-down youth, he talked about how there was nothing tougher than that. He was in a particularly poor region, and he was there much longer than other people. One of his half-sisters was persecuted to death. And then when he went to work in the grassroots in the 1980s, he went to Hebei, which was a region of particular dysfunction because of the Cultural Revolution, and he saw this factionalism and backwardness that he explicitly attributed to those radical politics of the Mao era. So I think that makes it unsurprising that in 1989, when students were protesting throughout the country, his frame of reference was the Cultural Revolution. And he made a speech saying that there's no such thing as true democracy, and when people are allowed to do what they want, they abuse it. And they use that opportunity to kidnap people and rob people and hurt people. So in conclusion, I think that this background allows us to put Xi Jinping in a place where he's more easily understandable. It helps us understand why he focuses on creating this sense of mission, cultural confidence, praising Marxism, and viciously going after anyone with a different narrative. But he also immediately contextualizes these goals. He talks about how Marxism needs to be brought into the Chinese context, that ideology is a guide, not a recipe book, that China can't move too fast, and that stability is necessary for everything else. But he also stresses continuity with the past in a way that I think people don't appreciate. His legitimation narrative isn't that reform and opening was wrong. It's that reform and opening created forces in society that were dangerous, that everyone wanted to resolve these challenges. They knew that these challenges were there, but Xi Jinping, by introducing more discipline and his own position as core within the party, was able to solve those dilemmas and therefore save reform and opening. And I think one of the reasons for that is he's skeptical of this idea of historical nihilism, this idea that if you criticize the party's past, it raises questions about the party today, which is why he can't reject the Mao era or reform and opening either, which is why he has this famous statement that neither of the 30 years can be rejected, either before reform and opening or after. So I think he's trying to signal a new path and a middle path that doesn't repeat the mistakes of the Cultural Revolution, but also recognizes reform and opening was creating problems the party needed to solve, especially the danger of westernization. So in the new work report, political report that just came out, there are small changes, of course, but they're variations on themes that he's been talking about for years. And Xi Jinping is someone with multiple goals at the same time that he puts in the same document that have certainly some tensions, but he can maneuver among them as a tactician at the same time. So the final implications of what I've said are, first of all, Chinese politics are not a popularity contest. The idea that there will be some course correction because of a coalition within the party that thinks he's incompetent or disagrees with them, it doesn't work like that. There isn't a trigger mechanism. And also that Xi Jinping probably won't destroy his country with a radical new Maoist agenda, that he's more cagey and cunning than that. But of course, the big question is what happens as challenges mount and Xi Jinping stays in power longer and longer, raising the likelihood that he himself may change. So I've gone for 15 minutes, so I'll stop there.
Terrific. Thanks you, Joseph. Jundai, you're second.
All right. Thank you so much, Dan and Derek, for getting us together. I debated with myself between two titles to give to my short presentation. One, do I call it 2022 Through a Glass Darkly? Or do I call it 2022 A Year of No Significance? This is, of course, a tribute to the late historian Rui Huang, by the way, who was a UM alum, and his book, 1587, speaking of the memory lane. 1587, A Year of No Significance. The emperor was fine. There were some plagues in the summer, but China always has something. There was nothing out of ordinary. There was nothing disastrous. But 1587 was 1 year before the Spanish Armada. China was on the brink of encountering a new world order. And Ming Dynasty in the 16th century was in decline. Ming Dynasty, as we know, according to Mao Zedong himself, resembled the most to his own reign. So, are we in a year of no significance? For example, we just learned yesterday that China's GDP report would be delayed indefinitely. There are many things looking forward we will not be able to observe, but the silence is resounding. To talk about how we got here, I invite you again to go back to the memory lane to quickly go through some key events and key themes in the 1980s. So we establish a baseline to understand what is socialism with Chinese characteristics and what is opening and reform in the past 40 years since 1978. After the disastrous Cultural Revolution and Mao's death in 1976, there was a consensus within the party that the party had to reform. But how? Economy, ideology, politics, all these things were up for debate. In December 1978, the third plenary session of the 11th CCP Central Committee decided to push forward economic reform, starting from agrarian reform, but to leave out ideology and political debate for another occasion. So very quickly after the meeting, we see household responsibility system implemented in all of China, in all rural China, whether you like it or not, you have to do it. Ending collective farming. Agricultural production went up quickly. And in 79, in 1980, special economic zones were established in 4 coastal cities to attract foreign investment. That started China's manufacturing boom and export. Despite the intra-party debate, again, Chen Yun was a main figure of that debate. In 1984, chaired by Hu Yaobang and supported by Deng Xiaoping, the third plenary session of the 12th CCP Central Committee made a decision on economic institutional reform and defined the goal as, quote, commodity economy with planning. This may sound very strange now, this term, commodity economy with planning, but it was a victory over planned economy. It was a victory over planned economy with commodity. And this is still the essence of the market economy with Chinese socialist characteristics that we're seeing in this insignificant year of 2022. While the economic reform, the spirit was go, 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 what happened with ideological opening was zigzag. Right after the decision to reform, on March 30th, 1979, Deng Xiaoping announced the 4 cardinal principles: socialism, proletariat dictatorship, Communist Party's leadership, and Marxism and Mao Zedong thoughts. These are the 4 cardinal principles not up for debate. They still govern China today as cardinal principles. And outside the meeting halls, however, in 1979, in 1980, people were changing. Young people wanted to wear jeans. People liked calendars with women with makeups. People wanted to sing pop songs, no more revolutionary marching songs. Marxist classics fell out of fashion quickly, and people wanted to read Sartre, Nietzsche, and Huntington. In 1980, the movie studio of the military, 八一电影制片厂, made a film titled Tormented Love, 苦恋. At the end of the film, the main character's daughter questioned him. You love this country with so much sorrow after so much torment, but does this country love you? That film never saw the light of the day. Party elders were fed up with the bourgeois liberal ideas. The year of 1983 ushered in the anti-spiritual pollution campaign, targeting from erotica to existentialism. This campaign was ended by the then party general secretary, Hu Yaobang. Despite the campaign, people still wanted to read Huntington. So in 1986, the CCP started another anti-bourgeois liberalization campaign, which ended with the 1986 student protest movement and the removal of the party general secretary, Hu Yaobang, in 1987. In the 1980s, political reform seemed to be something of no significance, precisely because it was the hardest, the most difficult to do. There was no reform. On August 18th, 1980, Deng Xiaoping gave a speech about reforming the institutions of the party, of the government leadership. Merely 2 weeks later, on August 31st, the Polish trade union, Solidarity, was established. A political organization outside the Communist Party? Hard no. There is no more discussion in the party afterwards. The second chance of political reform came in 1987, the 13th Party Congress, led by Zhao Ziyang. In the year leading up to it, Zhao and his people, they drafted a proposal for political institutional reform. Deng read it and said, hard no on separation of powers. Although the word is not mentioned here in the draft, I can smell it. 2 years later, Tiananmen happened. It was as much a student movement as a deep crisis within the CCP. And from then on, there was no mention anymore of political reform. I hope by now we have established a baseline for China's opening and reform. It is supported by 3 pillars: full speed economic reform, limited and controlled ideological opening, and no action in political reform. Deng Xiaoping conveyed this message clearly in his 1992 Southern tour. Strive for socialist market economy, no debate. This principle was canalized into the party constitution by the 14th Party Congress, called Socialism with Chinese Characteristics. Since the 1990s, what China has is a mixture of open and free transactions of commodities. You can buy anything from Taobao, almost anything on Taobao, except land is state-owned, banks are state-owned, permits and licenses are solely government planned and controlled. Government officials who are gatekeepers have been part of China's economic development, but also become extremely profitable rent seekers. The political problems that have persisted in the party due to no action in political reform were delayed and masqueraded by China's economic success and the tangible improvements in ordinary people's daily lives. But inequality has increased fast, and people's resentment toward government officials' corruption has grown exponentially. And that laid the foundation to Xi's rise. Since he came to power in 2012, especially in his first term, Xi initiated a sweeping anti-corruption campaign. This campaign was tremendously popular among ordinary people. It replaced a large portion of important party and government officials with Xi's own and shocked and paralyzed the rest. Now, by all signs, Xi has consolidated power and is seeking a third term. A strong man with a new vision faces no institutional checks and balances. The inaction in political reform in the 1980s that seemed of no significance has led to grave consequences in the 2010s and intensified in the 2020s. The intrinsic problems with one-party rule and personalistic politics that we have seen on full display in the 1960s have resurged with the new format in the new era. Thank you.
Great. Terrific. Mary, you're third.
Okay. Thanks. Thanks, Jundai and Joseph, and thanks to Derek and Dan for organizing this. I'm going to talk just a little bit about the current situation, mostly focusing on some aspects of the economy and how I see it relating to Xi Jinping's concentration of power. So what's been going on with the Chinese economy? Well before Xi became the general secretary, China has been going through a pretty long-term and important adjustment away from a development model that was dependent on labor-intensive manufacturing to more capital-intensive and innovation-based economy. This was partly due to demographic changes and the aging of the Chinese workforce, rising wages as migrant workers dried up from going from the rural areas to urban areas. But it was also driven partly by the regime's own ambitions to be more than the workshop of the world, making this shift away from its old development model necessary and actually needed. There has been a lot of difficulties for China to make this transition. There continues to be barriers to this kind of high quality growth. There are structural barriers to labor mobility. There's underinvestment in health and education, particularly in rural areas. And there are other things related to some of the aspects that Jundai was just mentioning in terms of delays in both political and economic reform. To keep the economy going in this last decade or so, instead what we've seen is overinvestment in infrastructure, real estate becoming a new substitute for labor-intensive manufacturing as revenue for local governments. And you might ask, why is it necessary for local governments to raise so much revenue? And that's due to the decentralized nature of China's fiscal relations, where local governments have a lot of unfunded mandates from the central government and need land revenue to fund these mandates from the central government. So this drove local governments to look for new sources of revenue, particularly in land speculation and real estate. Real estate now makes up more than a quarter of China's GDP, and in the absence of a property tax or robust income taxes, land revenue has been the only way for local governments to expand their coffers. This, of course, led to a real estate bubble and growing dissatisfaction in Chinese society about the very high real estate prices as people were priced out of owning a home, which is very, very important to Chinese families. So the government actually under Xi Jinping, in addition to the anti-corruption campaign that Jundai just mentioned, also began to crack down on real estate speculation, the famous quote from Xi Jinping, which he mentioned this week, that houses are for living in, not for speculation. So some of the slowdown was intentional and needed. But of course, this correction that was started before the COVID-19 pandemic and really started before the sharp downturn in U.S. China relations under Trump that has continued under Biden. So all to say that these lower growth rates that China is experiencing and now worried enough about it that GDP rates are not being announced or are being delayed. All of this was baked into this period of structural change that China was going through well before Xi Jinping came into office and was recognized before he came into office. So I think the question that I want to talk about is how does Xi Jinping's centralization and concentration of power around him affect these dynamics? And I want to just go back to the comparison that Joseph was making about Deng Xiaoping. At a also very critical time for China, right? It's moving away from the Maoist economy, adopting reform and opening up to foreign investment, and decollectivization of agriculture. And I think in addition to some of the things that Joseph was pointing to that Deng had that Xi doesn't, is that Deng Xiaoping was also able to create, or perhaps was in a time period when China's economy just had a lot more room to develop, and also a lot of room for economic growth to paper over a lot of contradictions. I call this sort of like there was incentive compatibility. So there was incentive compatibility between the central government and the local governments. You grow your local economy, you grow personally wealthy, your family is wealthy, and also your local economy may grow and people will be happy. There was a lot more incentive compatibility between government and private industry that also allowed for private industry to expand really rapidly in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s. And also between state and society, a kind of general agreement that totalitarian politics were on the wane, that people's private lives and private space would be expanded, and that politics would no longer be important to people's lives. So all of those things that happened under Deng Xiaoping and into the 1990s have started to fall away, right? There's no longer this incentive compatibility between the central and local governments, just in terms of the anti-corruption campaign. Private industry has been cracked down on, and society is feeling increasingly that politics are quite important and start to even intrude upon their private lives. So this leaves two things that I want to talk about in terms of the impact that Xi Jinping's reign is having on these longer term challenges. And I want to talk about two things in particular, the zero COVID policy and also his campaigns and crackdowns on capitalism, or CCC. So Zero COVID. Zero COVID is, we can talk in the Q&A about whether it's good or whether it's bad. It leads to, as we've seen over the past several months, rolling lockdowns on major Chinese cities and really, really extreme uncertainty for the economy and for people's daily lives, even beyond the economy. We know why zero COVID has been pursued. There was a decision early on to produce local vaccines and not depend on mRNA vaccines from abroad. We know that there is quite pronounced vaccine hesitancy in the population, particularly among people who most need vaccines, so elderly people and immune-compromised people. And we also know that the healthcare system, as we've seen in many, many other countries, can very easily be overwhelmed. And this is in a population where 260 million people are over 60, right? So the zero COVID makes sense based on some of these risks. So it's understandable why there is a dedication to that, but it's also creating, of course, as we see, very, very extreme economic costs and many hidden social costs that will probably come out more. The problem with Xi Jinping's concentration of power, and particularly his taking on of responsibility for zero COVID, that it makes it very difficult for China to move away from that policy, even as it begins to prove it's far outlasting its usefulness. It's very dangerous for the economy, but it's also dangerous for social stability. But the problem with Xi Jinping's taking of total responsibility is that what could happen is that there is a gradual decision to move away from zero COVID, then there's an uptick in cases and deaths, and then another return to zero COVID. So what we could see is just kind of waves and waves of attempts at reopening and then going back into zero COVID. In the context of centralization of power, of course, it becomes difficult for people around Xi Jinping to argue against zero COVID. And so also there's a danger of being in a kind of a bubble or, where he hears the same things that people tell him that he wants to hear. So zero COVID has intensified the economic challenges that China is facing, but because Xi Jinping has personally taken on the mantle of zero COVID, it becomes really difficult to move away from it. And this is something that I think is different compared to other leaders, where because of a clear sense of there was disagreements within the leadership and there was a healthy debate within the leadership about different policies, we see that not as vibrant under Xi Jinping. The second aspect of centralization is the crackdowns. So campaigns against corruption that Jundai just mentioned, but also more recently campaigns against tech companies and tech magnates like Jack Ma, and also crackdowns on digital education and other aspects of the internet economy. And what I see in these crackdowns and campaigns is a proclivity by Xi Jinping to use these sort of big man, strong man tactics rather than going towards institutional reforms that also might address economic inequality and other problems, such as the lack of a property tax or needs to do hukou reform and investments in education and health, for example. Instead, what Xi Jinping has done is he's scared the capitalists, but actually done very little to address the underlying problems. And what these crackdowns and campaigns have done is further affected entrepreneurship and investment into the economy. So everything has become far riskier under Xi Jinping. The anti-corruption campaign has kind of cut, like I said, these incentive structures that allowed for you scratch my back, I scratch yours between local officials and the private sector. It also means that what China used to do best in the economy, which is policy experimentation amid decentralization, is also much more difficult with these the clear threat of crackdowns from the central government. It also means that we might see capital being driven out. I think we're already seeing that a bit with capital outflows and currency depreciations, which is happening globally as well. Foreign investment, of course, may be less afraid of the political campaigns, but zero COVID is another reason for foreign investment to be very negative on China currently. So I just want to mention some other possibilities that might be seen as more positive or positives with Xi Jinping's reign, or silver linings with this centralization of power. So, for example, we know that hukou reforms in lower level cities have been progressing. Opening up city residency and access to services is being delinked from your hukou. That is something that we'll have to see what happens if it's expanded to the places where people really want to move to and not just lower level cities. We've also seen calls for social pooling of social welfare at provincial levels, so there's not such intense decentralization of the social welfare system, which could further sort of address the problems of economic inequality and lack of economic security. It might be the case that these are the types of things that China needs a really strong leader to do, and perhaps, not that I'm believing Nicholas Kristof that he's a political reformer, but perhaps that these really important economic reforms will be taken in his third term, including things like a property tax, which have been really aggressively opposed by the elites, both government and economic elites. And thirdly, as we've seen with the COVID policies and the ability to surveil the population for public health, the population in China is very, very legible to the state. And that probably is not great for human rights, but it might be great for the idea that the government no longer has any excuse not to be able to deliver social services to both the urban and the rural population. So I think compared to 2012, when we thought China was going through a hard time, currently the external and internal environment in China is much more challenging. Zero COVID may continue to alienate the unemployed, so alienating labor, whereas these crackdowns on capitalists alienate capital. And I don't think that Xi Jinping wants to alienate both labor and capital at the same time. Thank you.
Okay, well, tremendous set of remarks, lots of great attention to history and context. We have over 100 people on Zoom, in addition to the people who are here, so we have a great crowd. We should be in the big house. But before I wanted to open it up, I wanted to ask kind of almost a clarifying question in a way, because one thing that didn't come up in the conversation was how we should think about this party Congress as an event. And so I'm sort of curious about how the rhythms of politics and political change, economic change, policy change tend to happen in China, insofar as should we think of party congresses historically as something where this is when things happen? We should be looking for something out of this as this is a real event where we should expect to see something that will tell us about the next 5 years? Or is it the case, maybe better to think of it as this is a moment for Xi Jinping to consolidate his rule, make sure he goes through this sort of unprecedented jump of securing himself a third term, and only once he's done that would we expect to then see the kind of like change the directions or tackling some of these major challenges that Mary talks about, which only scratches the surface of the kind of challenges that exist. So should we be seeing this, should we be looking for an event? Should we be looking this for, is it a non-event if we don't see these things? Thinking historically, were there moments when, well, remember that party Congress when it really turned out to be a kind of a critical juncture? Does anyone want to say a little bit about just party Congresses as events in Chinese political development? How would you think about the current moment?
I guess I could start on this. I think in some ways it's important, in some ways it's not. I'll begin with the reasons why I don't think it's important. The first is Xi Jinping has already been a very strong leader for a long time. So the idea that he needs to go through one more Congress to clear out any last challengers, I think is not probably what's going on. Second, China is going to come out of this Congress with exactly the same set of challenges and exactly the same set of tools afterwards. And I think that there will be a mix of mistakes and victories, but not any fundamentally new capacities that we didn't see from before the Congress. The political report doesn't have a lot that's new. Certainly there are variations on a theme. The most interesting one, I think, is a more skeptical view towards the international environment, meaning a sense that China is now in a more dangerous situation than they were before. But most of the expressions have more continuity than less, or at least I went through the reports, and the one thing I thought was new, I Googled and realized actually I had read before. So in that sense, I doubt that it means a lot. At the same time, I think it's meaningful in the sense to bring everyone together and have a ritualistic reaffirmation of Xi Jinping's authority is useful for any leader. We will have a new leadership lineup. In some sense, there will be continuities there because Xi Jinping will be just as powerful as before. But personalities can matter a lot. Experience can matter a lot. So we may see some people acting a little bit differently within the leadership that might have some implications. But the most interesting thing is whether or not Xi Jinping will change over time, right? So Mao before 1959 was very different from after 1959, and Mao before and after the beginning of the Cultural Revolution was very different then too, right? So the atmosphere at Politburo meetings can change, right? So Mao was completely dominant during the 1950s, but it was precisely because of that dominance that people felt very comfortable raising different opinions from him because nobody would construe them as challenges to his authority, right? But then, of course, Mao was not very dominant in the 50s and 60s, actually in the 60s and 70s, but nobody dared to raise, their opinions. So whether or not there will be changes in, the way people approach Xi is a big question. So far, we've seen severe pathologies related to, as Professor Gallagher was saying, result likely of this concentration of decision-making. But the system also isn't entirely incapable of course correction at the same time. And I think that where we will see continuity or course correction will probably depend a lot on areas where Xi Jinping feels like he has a good handle. Some areas maybe he feels like he needs to trust other people, and what the policy toolbox looks like and what the specificities of information dissemination for those issues are.
Joseph, just want to address this as event or not event?
I agree. I think of it as a very important symbolic event, and of course the changes in leadership will be really interesting to observe, although I agree with Joseph's earlier comment that it will be hard to interpret what those changes mean, strong versus weak. I do think, this might just be my misplaced, I'm paying more attention to these things now than I was, say, 5 or 10 years ago. But one thing I've been struck by is that there seems to be more effort to package the party Congress in a way as to appear to be like a democratic Congress. Some of the words that have been used, some of the things that have been said, long descriptions of the elections within the party, and I believe that's very interesting. It's also fake. So I just want to make sure that people understand that those things are not functioning in the same way, although there's some selection going on. So I think that might be interesting because it seems to me to be an attempt to sell to the international audience that is watching this that this is something that is important politically in as much as an election would be important in the United States. And I think that is really interesting to do.
I will try to answer Dan's question within a very narrow scope. The big party Congress is symbolic, very meaningful, but I would be more attentive to when the 2,300 national representatives go home and the 200-something strong members of the Central Committee stay to have a closed-door meeting. So the plenary sessions would be something to watch more closely. And the smaller number, for example, the first was always about personnel. The second or third are more about the policy reform, things they carry out. And the bigger the numbers are, the more they're about politics. For example, the decision to start the Cultural Revolution is the 11th plenary session of the 8th Party Congress, 8th Central Committee of the Party Congress.
Well, we do have a microphone up here up front if anybody would like to the question for this spectacular panel that we have.
I'll ask a question. In this country, we're polling all the time to ascertain people's thoughts or feelings on various issues. And the Chinese government used to submit or request these kinds of responses from the population, which the population learned that the best way to respond to that was not with a critical comment, but with a question. is there any mechanism that they're using today to determine what the people want or what the people think, as a a broad understanding of what people would want to see happen?
Thank
I think the main way, and this is vastly improved over time, is that social media in China is vibrant. It's heavily censored, but the censorers can see what's being talked about, what sensitive issues are being talked about. And I think a lot of that information is effectively transmitted back to the government. It's done mostly by private companies. So I do think that the government has a much better sense, the party has a much better sense of what people are concerned about and what people feel, even though there is a lot of censorship and information control. So it's a nice substitute for a regime that doesn't allow for free media.
So actually, two of the questions we have online speak to this question of public opinion and political sentiment. So when we get a little bit specific with that, so Christopher Woody asks how much domestic political sentiment has on foreign relations at this point. And Jichen Zheng asks about the possible effects of growing popular discontent about zero COVID policies. So do we think in either of these areas that, to this gentleman's question about public opinion, that these are having any influence either in terms of the directions of the Congress or what to follow? Or do we think there's, it's not a popularity contest, as you said, Joseph, but clearly public pressure, the sense of the popular will in China has always been important. So do we get a sense that in either of these areas, foreign policy or zero COVID, that public sentiment is making a difference in China?
Well, it sort of depends on what you mean by public sentiment. So one question is the elites, and the other question is regular citizens of the PRC. And I can talk a little bit about the elites. My immediate reaction with regards to foreign policy, there had been very interesting questions raised about whether or not failures, alleged failures in Xi Jinping's foreign policy would create vulnerabilities for him before the Congress. And there had been suggestions that partnering with the Russian Federation so closely before the brutal invasion of Ukraine was a big mistake. They point to China's poor relations with so many outside powers, and people were wondering whether or not this would affect Xi Jinping to achieve what he wanted to at the Congress. I don't think that foreign policy tends to work in that way within the Chinese Communist Party. Of all of the issues, and I talked a little bit earlier about how different issues have different politics, when it comes to foreign policy, that has always been seen as the prerogative of the top leader. So in the 1980s, Li Xianyan was head of the sort of small group on foreign affairs, and he essentially just did whatever he thought Deng wanted him to do, and it deeply rankled Li Xianyan because he realized that his position there didn't really mean anything. And when the foreign ministry was tasked with writing a report on whether relations with the Soviet Union should be improved, they wrote two reports, one saying yes, one saying no, and then they waited to see what Deng Xiaoping really thought, and then they sort of submitted that report. So there isn't really a mechanism in the party whereby a difference in opinion or a sense that foreign policy is going poorly that would allow them to do anything about that. And in terms of zero COVID, I thought that Professor Gallagher's comments on this were really masterful because she really pointed to the dilemma that they're facing, right? So if we were talking about zero COVID a year ago, it would have been a very different story in terms of whether this was a policy success or failure. And it's kind of a nightmare situation for them, right? In the sense that I think that they probably, because as Professor Gallagher was saying, have a good sense of society, know how unhappy people are with this policy. But of course, you need to ask what the other policies might be. And if the other policy is lots of people getting sick and dying, that creates a lot of social instability as well, which raises questions as to the possibility, first of all, of whether or not people within the party who might matter think that zero COVID is a failure. Maybe they don't. Maybe they see things similarly to Xi Jinping in the sense of feeling stuck and not seeing a better option. But ultimately, I think, as Professor Gallagher put so eloquently, this is Xi Jinping's decision ultimately, right? So, And finally, I'll just say in terms of public opinion, and of course Professor Gallagher knows much more about this than I do, the state has a lot of capacity, precisely because of all of these tools that she described that they have developed. So I think they care about public opinion, certainly. They don't want it to turn into a crisis, but they can really, really, really repress when they need to as well. So.
I was just thinking about Clinton said about censorship. When internet came out, Clinton said with such confidence, it's like glue on the wall. Censorship is like glue on the wall. You just cannot stop.
Jelly.
Jelly.
Jelly on the
Jelly
wall.
on the wall.
Even worse. Doesn't stick.
I think he would be surprised how innovative inter-party innovation of technical censorship and management are. Sometimes it's not about blunt suppression. Sometimes it's about channeling the attention. Sometimes it's about initiating conversation. Sometimes it's about leading everybody against another batch of people. So censorship comes out in a very different form. And sometimes we thought, and it looks like public opinion, but it's party-led opinion.
I just want to say, too, I'm very hesitant to talk about what I think about public opinion in China. I haven't been to China for 3 years. That's the longest I've not been to China since 1989. And I think in the context of like a very clear ideological shift, with politics being more important, I simply don't trust public opinion polls when they're done. I think there are a lot of problems right now in terms of how we're collecting public opinion in China, and preference falsification is really, really important to consider. I was reading somebody talking about Russian public opinion polls right now, and they said basically people in Russia think of taking a poll as the politics of acclamation, right? You just say what you think the person, the pollster wants to hear, which is what the government wants to hear. And I think it's possible in China that a similar thing is happening. And so what do polls actually mean? I think it's really hard to tell. In terms of dissatisfaction in this kind of ideological environment, I think zero COVID is clearly the one issue where people can probably make some clear disagreements because it's about livelihood issues, which the party does care about. And generally speaking, the party has been more open in allowing people to express dissatisfaction with livelihood issues. But whether in terms of foreign policy and Ukraine and the U.S. China relations, I think that's very, very hard for people to openly oppose the government's policies.
Great, thank you. Please, in the back.
Hi. Oh, thank you so much for the amazing panel. I just have a kind of arbitrary question. Just based on your intellectual intuitions or just any prediction, just what do you think the future, the prospect of China under President Xi would be like, just very general. That's for you. You could just speak very openly.
That's the big picture question.
Take another question as well, and we can collect a few.
So you talked about how she will likely delegate responsibility to other parties to manage certain facets of China. And so I'm wondering, to what extent do you think that she will entrust management of the economy to other officials, and what will his rationale be in doing so?
So we've got hands popping up, so why don't we collect a few, and you guys keep writing, and can then respond to whichever and however you can. Sound good?
I like that. Yeah.
You like that? All right. Mary's the boss. She likes that.
Ultimate deniability.
You're the Xi Jinping of the event.
I had a quick question about the issue of succession, because I believe we're not expecting Xi Jinping to name any possible successor at this party congress. And so, but Xi Jinping is 70, and as far as I can tell, he's mortal. And so I was wondering if there is any other candidate waiting in the wings who could possibly be a successor to Xi Jinping? And is there a mechanism in Chinese elite politics for if something does happen to Xi Jinping over the next 5 years, is there any possible method, any unity candidate, any way that, any designated successor, I guess, that could step up?
Thank you.
I have a quick question regarding, like, you're predicting that, well, I think it's widely known that China is currently in a position where it's been sticking to their COVID policy for very long, and she might need a step, like, might need a trigger, like in Chinese, 给个台阶下, where he might be able to stop this policy. And what do you predict that trigger to be?
I have a question, I think, that is building on some of the ones we've just heard. I've been really intrigued to hear the references to struggle and to being able to suku, right? To being able to persevere in difficult times. That has, been part of a variety of speeches recently, and I'm wondering whether the experiences of the last year and a half, whether it's zero COVID, whether it is the functional success of the crackdown in Xinjiang, whether it's the functional success of the crackdown in Hong Kong, all of these are basically also function as tools to say to the Chinese people, yes, your life is not as good as you hoped it would be a couple of years ago, but what's your alternative? You can live with what we've got now, right? And as long as you can live with it, it's better to live with it because there are no alternatives to change it.
Take maybe one more, and then get some response.
I would like to ask the question about their policy of, that was already announced by the Xi Jinping, policy of reunification with Taiwan, and actually its possible implications in their situation in Ukraine. Can it be changed in connection with this issue?
So why don't we take a pause? There are going to be more hands. We'll have time for another round of questions, I believe. But does anybody want to take any of those they're most motivated to address and take a couple of minutes? Joseph, you want to go first?
Sure. So 2 words came up that I think a lot about: succession and struggle. So maybe I'll have a set of brief remarks on those. In terms of succession, Xi Jinping is relatively young. So I don't think that he feels a need to resolve the succession issue immediately. Xi Jinping's father was proximate to the pathologies of succession politics for decades, which strikes me as likely that Xi Jinping knows what they were. And the fundamental story there was that both Mao and then Deng went through a lot of different successors that they named, but then ultimately removed them. And the core puzzle there, and it kept repeating, is that none of the deputies ever resisted or bucked the top leader, but they still lost the trust of both Mao and Deng because they incorrectly intuited what the top leader wanted. So when you have this system, and this actually gets to the delegation question as well, where there is someone who has all of the authority, but somebody else is making day-to-day decision-making, that's a recipe for disaster. And I think that Xi Jinping probably understands that, which might help explain why he is both the core and the one making lots of decisions, and why he hasn't named a successor. So presumably at some point, he'll want to think about a successor, but he'll be facing dilemmas that can be managed, not problems that can be solved. Now, why do I say that? Well, first of all, a lot of this is personality. It will have a lot to do with the political skill of the person who might be the successor and whether they can convince Xi Jinping that they're the right person to do that. Another is events. If it hadn't been the student protesters in 1986 or 89, Hu Yaobang or Zhao Ziyang might have had a very different fate, right? And events can't be predicted. Personalities can't be predicted. So I think Xi Jinping ultimately will probably take his time, as much time as he can, and will also struggle to find a solution to the problem of what happens when you name a successor when all you think about all the time is how the party needs one core and how you function when suddenly you have the possibility of 2 headquarters. So lots of problems in terms of that he's facing that he'll be thinking about at the same time. In terms of struggle, I did a Control F search for how many times the word struggle appeared in my biography of Xi Jinping's father. It's like dozens, right? And this is a really fascinating idea. And as I said earlier, Xi Jinping's father went through horrendous life experiences, and he talked about how this was all struggle and how, as I said earlier, revealed his love of the party and rededicated himself to the party. Xi Jinping made a very interesting set of remarks the very first time he traveled overseas to Russia when he met with these sinologists. And he said, look, a lot of people think my generation is oriented towards the West, but I rose under two literatures, the Chinese and the Russian. And I love to read this book, What Is to Be Done, by Chernyshevsky, because there was this character, Rakhmetov, who liked to sleep on a bed of nails to forge his revolutionary elan. And so therefore, when I was a sent-down youth, I used to walk around in the wind and the rain so I could struggle too and build that up. And as I was saying before, Xi Jinping is somebody who really wants to create a sense of mission and confidence and belief in the party. And how do you do that? Well, as he said in his political report, he has a second answer to how to prevent dynastic decline, and that is self-revolution, self-reform. And to do that, you need to have this perpetual sense of struggle. And when you're facing challenges, which China increasingly is, because as we've been talking about, things were a lot easier in terms of the 1980s and 90s in terms of low-hanging fruit, you need to prepare people for the relationship with the West, which Xi Jinping has repeatedly said will only get worse because of the ideological element, such that the West will become increasingly brazen the stronger China gets, because it can't accept a communist superpower. So I think that we'll see a lot of this kind of language, but not in the sense of the Cultural Revolution. So he'll want to use it, but sort of keep the lightning in a bottle so it doesn't lead to that kind of chaos of utopianist politics that were so destabilizing in the Cultural Revolution.
Jundai?
I'll put a helmet on my head and try to make predictions. I think the future, the next 5 to 10 years, will be a chaotic stalemate. Pushed by economic and social realities, certain things have to be done. But then again, power struggles, political struggles, personnel struggles will pull the policy change to the other direction back into the stalemate. And in the system of personalistic politics and strongman, candidates for successors is always a problem. If you are a strongman, you want somebody capable to be your deputy, but very quickly this deputy will become a problem. For Mao, his solution was to replace one with another. In 1964, at the peak of Liu Shaoqi's power, his deputy, this was only 2 years before the Cultural Revolution, Liu Shaoqi became very, very successful and esteemed because of the Four Clean movement, to clean the bureaucracy, to discipline the entire party. But Mao said to him, "What's so special about you? I can hit you down by waving my pinky." And he did that 2 years later. In 1967, the February countercurrent? Yeah. 4 marshals, 3 deputy premiers challenged Mao about the Cultural Revolution. Mao said, "What's so special about you? If the Cultural Revolution failed because of you, I believe the military will follow me. If the military does not follow me, Comrade Lin Biao will follow me. We will go back to Jinggangshan to start a guerrilla war against you all." I really doubt Xi can work himself above the party. He's a man of the party. His capacity, his power comes from the party. He has to be at the top of the hierarchy of the party, but not above the party and beyond the party.
Okay, so, oh God. So the question about whether China, I think, is important. And I think I just wanted to say, because this is related to U.S. China relations, is that I think right now I totally agree about chaotic stalemate, maybe not just internally, but also externally, and that may be the best outcome. I think right now, U.S. China relations obviously are at their worst point since we had diplomatic relations. So since before 1971. So obviously before 1971, they were worse than they are now because we were even fighting a war against China in Korea in the 50s. But I do think right now we're in a very dangerous situation with U.S.-China relations because both countries feel a sense of weakness and inferiority and domestic challenges. And it further sort of enforces a kind of zero-sum mentality. And this, I think, is really something to consider in terms of how the United States government deals with China in this situation. And it's not easy in the United States domestically either because of our own domestic politics. But I just want to say that I think when we think about wither China, we should also think about wither the United States and why there might be this very kind of dangerous combination of weakness and inferiority in both countries at the same time. In regards to Anne's really interesting question about this use of struggle and to be completely paranoid about this, I did wonder during the Shanghai lockdowns whether or not this was an attempt to really tame Shanghai and to put Shanghai's population in a situation where they really do have to think about almost like a war footing. Like, this is what struggle means, so get used to it. And that might be, if you could see it almost as a chain of events, right? Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Shanghai. I don't think Taiwan is next, actually, and not in the short term, because I think one thing that the Chinese military and party has seen is that with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that it's really, really complicated. And obviously Taiwan and Ukraine are completely different places, and I am by no means a military expert, but I think Russia's difficulty in Ukraine have probably made it less likely that we'd see Taiwan being the next in terms of a kind of teaching a lesson, which would be a really dramatic move. The notion of struggle and utopian ideals for Xi Jinping is really interesting to me in relation to the economy and this use of common prosperity as kind of this. It's not a new term, but he's really taken on this idea that common prosperity can be achieved. And I think what's been happening, and this goes to this idea of stalemate, is that he has a kind of split personality. He's utopian about the economy in a really interesting way, in a very Marxist way. And yet he also has this love of struggle, and he hates laziness, and he hates lying flat, and he hates himself when he first went to the countryside and smoked cigarettes. And I recommend the podcast The Prince by The Economist, which Joseph is figured in quite often, because it's a great insight, which I hadn't known that much about his early life. And so I think what happens is that the technocrats then tell him, like, well, we can't possibly do these major reforms because it will make people lazy, right? If you give them social welfare, they'll stop working. And so I think he's actually tamed in this really interesting way, that they use his utopian ideals and his love of struggle against him and kind of control him in that way that makes his policies so far actually really, really disappointing, I have to say. So.
Great. A few of the hands that were up before. Do you want to try to get at least a couple of questions in and then be able to go around?
Oh, yeah, I was going to ask about any prediction on the mainland Taiwan relation.
Okay. Some more on Taiwan.
Hi, it's interesting that Dr. Liu and I think Dr. Gallagher mentioned about how President Xi was the scared away for the capitalists, but some contrary facts was about what happened in the past few years. For example, labor crackdown, the clear violation and the promotion of violation of the labor laws, and the promotion of extreme nationalism through education system, and especially with the stagnation of economic growth in China, which was the legitimacy of the party's rule in China for a really long time, ever since the reformation from the government. So with all these facts, with a contradictory belief, what is his end game particularly? What does he want to achieve ultimately? What's the direction he's heading to? Because I personally draw parallel to the about his narrative about the national rejuvenation, that he is trying to use the similar narrative from Nazi Germany, very contrary to his supposedly socialist beliefs. So personally, I'm kind of confused about what direction he's going to. Thank you.
Thank you. Others? We've got one. How about we get one more question? One more hand? Okay. Or here, why don't you go ahead and then we'll see if we have time.
Hi, I got a question regarding the relationship between the premier and the general secretary. So I was wondering why the relationship between Xi and Li Keqiang was so different compared to what Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao had, and why and did Li Keqiang ever create any challenge or like restriction to Xi? And do you guys think that Li Keqiang can secure Wang Yang or other Communist Youth League member as the next premier, or Li Qiang, the party secretary of Shanghai, will be able to become the next premier? Thank you.
Okay. Let's go ahead and, we'll just keep going. A couple more. Just try to be brief, because if there are a few more hands, I want to give them time to answer. So try to be brief. Thank you.
So I'm not sure if it's a naive or dumb question, but I'm wondering which part, is it America or China, that bear the larger responsibility in deteriorating the U.S.-Chinese relationship? And China, or be it China or America, how much to what extent is it justified to want to worsen their relationship? And also, I'm curious about Taiwan. Like, it's related to the other question they have. So the parties seem to comment that they want to unify before 2049. So can you comment on that? Is it just saying, or do they actually have some sort of agenda? Thank you.
Maybe these two, but try to be just keep it to one question if possible. Thanks.
I heard some voices that Chinese people are not suitable for democracy, but there is a Chinese democracy society in Taiwan. So I'm wondering, because also Taiwanese society has switched from the dictatorship to democracy in 1990s. So is Taiwanese mode, the political system of Republic of China government, is suitable for current Chinese government? Thank you.
Maybe just one last one back here, and then we'll have about 10 minutes to...
Yeah, thank you very much. I have more a question regarding energy and ecology. Like Russia, so China is really focused on clean energy production, but at the same time it uses hydrocarbons. So do you foresee in the future any changes to energy, like security landscape? So thank you so much.
I think almost everything is on the table now. So if maybe about 2 to 3 minutes each. Again, don't feel like you have to respond to everything, but if there's anything you'd especially like to answer, Jundai, would you like to go first?
I'll go.
The final go round.
Please read Professor Dan Slater and Joseph Wang's recent book, Development and Democracy, so we can understand there is nothing cultural entrenched to Chinese not being able to run democracy. Taiwan, I'll say one thing. The tone, people have talked about the tone being more coercion prone with the 20th than the 19th Party Congress. I have not felt that much difference. But one thing is, there's just no plan of running Taiwan after reunification. What will Taiwan look like? The party doesn't have a blueprint plan for Taiwan. So whether that unification by force is imminent or it's always a talking point, a rally point for nationalist support, I'm leaning toward the latter. Xi Li Huwen, the Communist Youth League, the influence of the Chinese Communist Youth League has greatly diminished, if not altogether gone. So Li Keqiang doesn't have a faction backing him anymore. So the relationship between Xi and Li is not equal. Hu Wen, not equal, but more or less peers.
Right. Mary, we'll go next, and then Joseph go last.
Sure. I will not answer all the questions, unfortunately. But just the question about, so who's more at fault? That's a good question. It's not easy to answer. And I wouldn't even try to answer it in terms of like who did what to whom, because it's a very long story, U.S. China relations. I think the key, a lot of people say like, don't make this into a conflict between democracy and autocracy. But I think that's almost wrong, because I think the problem is the regime difference. And it goes to, I think, a feeling in the United States, particularly under Xi, because a lot of this did really become exacerbated under Xi Jinping, is that U.S. elected officials have to respond to what voters care about. And I think there has been increasing pressure on both parties to respond to China's competitive threat to the U.S. economy, particularly around jobs and employment and manufacturing. And that has driven, I think, a lot of U.S. policies. Now we see other policies becoming more important related to military competition and things like that, which are something else that's going on and maybe more important. But I think there's a sense, I think, in the United States that the problem of dealing with China is that there are a lot of diverse interests in China. There are a lot of diverse voices in China. There are lots of ways in which China's economy doesn't help everybody in China, but those voices cannot be heard, right? And so they're heard in the United States, and officials in the United States have to respond to them, but that's not the case for the Chinese leadership. So there is, I think, a real fundamental problem with the fact that these are the two largest economies in the world. They're completely economically intertwined, and yet they rely on completely different political systems. So I'm not saying one is right and one is wrong, but I think it's really, the regime type really does matter. Just to the question about what is Xi Jinping's endgame, I mean, you raised the crackdown on labor activists, which of course I've studied a lot, and I just have to say, like I said in my remarks, he's going after both labor and capital at the same time, which is dangerous. I mean, I think internally among the elite, yeah, he probably doesn't face a big threat, but I think social stability will be an issue in the coming years, as it has been in the past in China. But just to say kind of maybe a little bit too cynically, I think his end game is control. Right? His end game is control.
Yeah. Joseph?
So I'm the last thing between all of you and dinner, so I'll just talk about Taiwan. It's hard to think of an issue that's probably more emotionally salient for Xi Jinping. So Xi Jinping's father, his primary bailiwick for decades within the Chinese Communist Party was to run the United Front, which meant that during the revolution, one of his chief jobs was convincing KMT people to defect. Then in the 1980s, when the United Front was reestablished after it was destroyed during the Cultural Revolution, it was primarily targeted towards Taiwan. And one of the last things that Xi Jinping's father ever did was try to establish a back channel to have some kind of communication between Taipei and Beijing, which failed. Xi Jinping definitely sees this as a legacy issue, I think partly because of his father, but also because of his very nationalistic views of Chinese history. When he met with Ma Ying-jeou, the Taiwanese president at the time in 2015, he told him a story about how Angela Merkel allegedly told Xi Jinping that Germans had lost territory to history, and asked Xi Jinping why Chinese can't be more like Germans. And Xi Jinping, as he told Ma Ying-jeou, responded to Angela Merkel, "We Chinese are not like you Germans. What was bequeathed to us by our ancestors is something that we will never give up." And he asked, what the hell does Li Denghui believe in anyways? So I think he sees these people in Taiwan who see themselves as more Taiwanese, as Chinese, as deeply upsetting. And again, this gets back to this story of him really believing in ideals and conviction. But at the same time, these sentiments are counterbalanced by the fact that he knows the Taiwan issue pretty well, right? So he was in Zhejiang and Fujian when he met with lots of Taiwanese people, and they mostly were pretty impressed with him. And Xi Jinping has repeatedly said that we can't fight wars unless we are definitely convinced that we can win them. And Xi Jinping really cares about the CCP, and he doesn't want to stumble into something that challenges its own its position within China, which with the war with Taiwan might do. So I think that his view is that as long as Taiwan isn't obviously escaping and moving farther away, and that he can make a case that trends are in the PRC's favor, meaning that when they do finally make a decisive move, it will be even less costly then, that he can afford to wait. The danger is that both China and the United States both think that the other is changing the status quo and that they both need to do things to shore up their own situation. That's a recipe for instability, and whether or not that gets managed effectively is something I don't know. And of course, there's always possibilities for accidents, especially during moments of tension. So that's my answer. And finally, the 20th Party Congress signaled no new, as you were saying, urgency on the Taiwan question. So a little bit of good news, I guess. But who knows?
So one quick apology to the audience on Zoom that we couldn't get to all of the questions. I'm sure there are people in the audience here too. We didn't get to all of them, but they were fantastic questions. I want to give a big thanks to Derek Groom. Earlier, Joseph described Mary as masterful. I assure you that Derek Groom is the most masterful person in this building in the way he puts together these sessions, these hybrid sessions. It's just been remarkable to work with him on these. But most of all, I want to thank the panelists, Mary Gallagher, Jundai Liu, and Joseph Torigian for a really fantastic panel. So thanks you all for coming, and thanks for the discussion. Thanks.